The knock on my bedroom door came at 12:03 a.m. I remember the time because I was still awake, staring at my laptop, finishing a freelance design contract due by sunrise. My name is Renata Michelle Duval, 26 years old, and up until that moment, I thought I understood my family. Before we continue, please hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Now let's continue. "Get up," my mother, Cheryl Duval, said through the door, her voice flat, stripped of anything resembling warmth. "You need to pack your things tonight." I opened the door slowly, blinking against the hallway light. My father, Grady Duval, stood behind her, arms crossed, refusing to meet my eyes. That alone told me this wasn't a joke. "Pack for what?" "Mama, it's midnight." "Your sister needs this room for the nursery," Cheryl said, like she was reading off a grocery list. "Terrence proposed. They're moving in. The baby's coming in 6 months." My chest tightened. Danielle, my younger sister, the golden child who'd never worked a steady job past 3 months in her life, was pregnant, and somehow that made me disposable. "I pay $400 a month toward this house," I said, my voice cracking despite my effort to sound calm. "I've lived here 2 years since I moved back to help take care of Grandma Odessa before she passed. Where exactly am I supposed to go at midnight?" "That's not our problem," Grady finally spoke, still not looking at me. "You're grown. Figure it out." I stood there in my socks, the cold hallway floor seeping through, and felt something inside me quietly, permanently, shut a door. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I packed 2 suitcases, my laptop bag, and the small cedar box Grandma Odessa left me, the one thing they never bothered to ask about because they assumed it was worthless. They had no idea what was inside it. By 1:47 a.m., I was standing on the curb of our modest house in East Point, Georgia, watching my father lock the door behind me without a word. I called the only person I trusted completely, my best friend Kiana Marsh, and she picked me up in her pajamas, no questions asked, just fury in her eyes on my behalf. "They really did that to you," she said, gripping the wheel. "On your birthday week." I hadn't even mentioned that part. My birthday was in 4 days. Nobody in that house remembered. To understand how I ended up on that curb, you have to understand Danielle. Danielle was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment she was born, our house rearranged itself around her. She got the bigger room. She got the car at 16 while I took 2 buses to community college. When she dropped out of cosmetology school twice, Cheryl called it finding herself. When I worked 40 hours a week while carrying a full course load in architecture, Grady called it showing off. I used to ask myself why. It wasn't until I was 17, eavesdropping through a cracked door, that I got a partial answer. "She's not even really," Cheryl had started, before Grady cut her off sharply. "Don't," he warned. "Not now. Not ever." I never finished that sentence in my head for years. I told myself I imagined it. That grief and teenage insecurity made me hear things that weren't there. I buried it the way I buried most things in that house, quietly, without ceremony, and kept moving forward. What I did know was this: Grandma Odessa, my father's mother, never once treated me like an afterthought. She was the one who taught me to read blueprints at 9 years old, sitting on her porch in Marietta with sweet tea and old copies of Architectural Digest. She was the one who whispered, the week before she passed, "Baby, don't you let anybody in that house make you feel small. You come from more than they know." I didn't understand what she meant, not then. When she died, she left me the cedar box. Cheryl rolled her eyes at the funeral. "A box of old letters," she muttered. "That woman really left you a box." I kept it anyway. I never opened it. Some part of me wasn't ready. That part of me was about to change everything. Kiana let me crash on her couch for 2 nights before I found a $54 a night motel off Camp Creek Parkway. It smelled like bleach and old carpet, but it was mine, and nobody could knock on the door and tell me to leave. On the second night, sitting cross-legged on the stiff comforter, I finally opened Grandma Odessa's cedar box. Inside were photographs I'd never seen. Her, decades younger, standing in front of a sprawling white house with palm trees I didn't recognize from Georgia. There was a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges, and a sealed envelope with my name written in her careful cursive, "For Renata, when you're ready." My hands shook as I opened it. Baby, if you're reading this, then you're finally free of that house, and I am so proud of you for surviving it. Before I married your grandfather and moved to Georgia, I had a different life in California. A life your father knows about, but chose to bury out of shame and pride. My maiden name was Odessa Whitfield. My father, your great-grandfather, was Theodore Whitfield, and he built something none of you ever knew about. There is a lawyer named Marcus Ellery in Los Angeles. Call him. Tell him who you are. He's been waiting 14 years for you to come of age and claim what's yours. I read it 4 times. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. At 6 a.m., I called the number written beneath the signature. A man's voice, older, careful, answered on the second ring. Ellery and Cross Law Offices. My name is Renata Duval, I said, my voice unsteady. I think my grandmother left me something. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Ms. Duval, we have been trying to locate you for 14 years. 3 days later, I was on a one-way flight to Los Angeles, funded by an advance Marcus Ellery wired me without hesitation, something that alone told me this was real. His office sat on the 14th floor of a glass building in Century City. He was a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s with kind but sharp eyes, the kind that had clearly seen decades of family secrets unravel across his desk. Your great-grandfather, Theodore Whitfield, built one of the first black-owned real estate development firms in Southern California in the 1960s, he explained, sliding a thick folder across the table. By the time he passed in 1998, the family trust was valued at just under $40 million. Your grandmother, Odessa, was set to inherit the majority share, but she chose to walk away from that life after a falling out with her brother over how the company was being run. She married your grandfather and moved to Georgia to start over, quietly, away from the money and the politics. So the money just sat there? I asked. Not sat, grew. Odessa never touched her share, but she never signed it away either. She kept it in trust, naming you as sole beneficiary the year you turned 12. He paused. There's something else you should know. Your father was contacted twice, once when you were 14 and again when you were 21, informing him that a trust existed in your name and would mature at 26. He declined further correspondence both times. The room tilted slightly. He knew? This whole time he knew? And he let me believe we were struggling? Let me help pay bills at a house I didn't even own. I can't speak to his reasoning, Ellery said carefully, but I can tell you the trust matured last month, including the primary asset, a residence in Beverly Hills, valued today at approximately $60 million. The estate is now, legally and entirely, yours. I sat in that leather chair and felt 14 years of quiet cruelty rearrange itself into a single, devastating sentence. They threw me out of a room I paid for, while sitting on the knowledge that I owned a mansion 3,000 miles away. The house was on Loma Vista Drive, tucked behind iron gates and a wall of manicured hedges. 9 bedrooms, a pool that curved like a comma around a guest house, a view that stretched from the hills down to the ocean haze on clear days. The staff, a groundskeeper named Hector and a longtime housekeeper named Miriam, who had worked for my great-grandfather since 1991, greeted me like they'd been waiting. Miss Whitfield's granddaughter, Miriam said softly, studying my face. You have her eyes. I stood in the marble foyer, suitcase still in hand, and cried for the first time since the night I was thrown out. Not from sadness, from the sheer, disorienting weight of finally understanding who I was. That night, I called Kiana. I need you to sit down, I told her. When I finished explaining, she was silent for almost 30 seconds. Renata, they put you out on the street and you were sitting on $60 million the whole time. They didn't know I knew, I said, but they knew about the trust. Grady's known since I was 14. So what are you going to do? I looked out at the pool, the city lights beginning to flicker on below the hills, and felt something settle in my chest. Not rage exactly, but resolve. I'm going to let them find out the way I found out everything else in that house, I said. The hard way. It took 11 days for the story to break. A local Atlanta blog covering Black wealth and business picked up a press release from Ellery's office about the Whitfield Trust finally passing to its rightful heir. My name was in it. My photo, taken at the estate, was in it too. Cheryl called first. 4 missed calls in 1 hour, then a voicemail, her voice syrupy in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Renata, baby, call your mother. I saw the article. We are just so proud of you. You know your daddy always believed in you. I didn't call back. Danielle texted next. Girl, why didn't you tell us? We should celebrate as a family. Me and Terrence want to see the house. I stared at that message for a long time before Grady finally called himself, something he hadn't done unprompted in over a year. Renata, he said when I picked up, his voice careful, rehearsed. I know things got said that night that maybe went too far. Your mother was stressed about the baby. But family is family. We were hoping, now that things have changed for you, maybe we could put the past behind us, start fresh. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to hear it. You knew, I finally said. 14 and 21. Ellery's office contacted you twice. You let me believe we had nothing, while you sat on the knowledge that I owned a house bigger than any building I've ever set foot in. You let me pay rent in a house you didn't even own outright, Grady. And when you didn't need my $400 a month anymore, you put me on the curb at midnight. Renata, it wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, I said, and hung up. They showed up anyway. 3 days later, a rideshare pulled through the gates. Ellery's office had apparently given them the address, a mistake he later apologized for profusely. Cheryl, Grady, and Danielle, 7 months pregnant now, stood in my driveway, mouths slightly open at the scale of the house. I met them at the door, but didn't invite them in. This is insane, Cheryl said, looking past me into the foyer. Renata, you can't just cut off your own family. Blood is blood. Blood didn't stop y'all from putting me out at midnight, I said. Blood didn't stop you from hiding a trust fund from me for over a decade while I worked 2 jobs in community college. Grady stepped forward. We were trying to protect you. That kind of money changes people, changes families. Odessa walked away from it for a reason. No, I said, my voice steady now, years of swallowed anger finally surfacing clean and clear. Grandma Odessa walked away from a company run by people she didn't trust. You walked away from telling your daughter the truth because it was easier to keep me small, keep me useful, keep me paying $400 a month while Danielle got everything handed to her. Danielle's face crumpled. So this is my fault now? I didn't ask to be treated better than you. No, I said, softer now, because some small part of me still ached for the child she'd been, shaped by the same broken house that shaped me. But you never once asked why. Not one time in 23 years did you ask why I was always the one who had to make room. Nobody had an answer for that. You need to leave, I said. Not because I hate you, because I finally understand what respect is supposed to feel like, and I'm not giving that up for people who only remembered I existed once I was worth something. Word travels fast in a family like ours, even across 3,000 miles. Within a month, the story of the family who threw out their daughter, only for her to inherit a $60 million Beverly Hills estate, had spread through relatives, church members, and old family friends back in East Point. My Aunt Verna, Grady's older sister, called me directly. I always wondered why he never brought up his mama's side of the family, she admitted. Now I understand. He was ashamed she left that money behind, and ashamed you might find out he let it sit there while treating you like a burden. Terrence, Danielle's fiancé, quietly ended their engagement 2 months later. Word through the family grapevine was that he'd overheard Danielle on the phone, saying she hoped Renata would come around and share some of that money, since we're family. And something about the entitlement in her voice didn't sit right with him anymore. Grady lost his position as a deacon at Mount Calvary Baptist after Pastor Wilkins, a longtime family friend, heard the full story from Aunt Verna and quietly suggested he step back and reflect. Cheryl, humiliated by the community's reaction, stopped attending the women's ministry she'd led for 9 years. I didn't orchestrate any of it. I didn't need to. Consequences have a way of finding people who spend years avoiding the truth. I focused instead on rebuilding Whitfield Development, my great-grandfather's company, which had been managed loosely by trustees for over a decade. I brought in Kiana, who had a business degree gathering dust while she worked retail, and made her my chief operations officer. Together we launched a scholarship fund in Grandma Odessa's name for young black women in architecture and design, the field she'd introduced me to on that porch in Marietta. One evening, sitting by the pool with Miriam as she watered the hydrangeas she'd tended for 30 years, I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since Ellery's office. "Did you know my grandmother well before she left for Georgia?" Miriam smiled, setting down the watering can. "I was young when I started here, but I remember Miss Odessa. Brilliant woman, fierce. She used to say the hardest thing about leaving wasn't the money. It was knowing her own brother would rather burn the company to the ground than watch her succeed without him." "Sounds familiar," I murmured. "Families repeat themselves," Miriam said gently. "Unless somebody breaks the pattern. Your grandmother broke it once, by leaving. Seems to me you broke it a different way, by staying and building something they can't take from you." I thought about that for a long time after she left for the night. About Danielle, alone now, expecting a baby in a house that would probably shift its favoritism onto that child the way it once did onto her. About Grady's silence, and Cheryl's syrupy voicemail, and the version of myself that used to shrink to fit into whatever room they allowed me. I wasn't that version anymore. 6 months later, I stood on the terrace of the Loma Vista house, watching the sun set orange and gold over the hills, a glass of sweet tea in my hand, the one habit from Grandma Odessa's porch I never let go of. Whitfield Development had broken ground on its first new project in 11 years, affordable housing for first-generation homeowners in South Los Angeles, built with the same care Theodore Whitfield once poured into his first development in 1968. Kiana walked out onto the terrace, tablet in hand. "Scholarship applications just crossed 400. We're going to need a bigger committee." "Good problem to have," I said, smiling for what felt like the first time in months without an ache underneath it. My phone buzzed. A text from Danielle, the first in weeks, had the baby. A girl, named her Odessa. "I'm sorry for everything. I understand if you can't forgive us yet." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something soften in my chest despite everything. I didn't respond right away. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't something you owed on anyone else's timeline. I thought about the girl I'd been at midnight 9 months earlier, standing on a curb in East Point with 2 suitcases and a cedar box, believing she had nothing. I thought about how wrong that girl had been, not about the money, but about her own worth that had never depended on that house, or that family, or anyone's permission to take up space. I raised my glass toward the hills, toward the ocean haze in the distance, toward the porch in Marietta I'd never see again, but would never stop carrying with me. You were right, Grandma, I said quietly. I came from more than they knew. And for the first time in my life, I believed it completely. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If this story kept you hooked, leave a like, subscribe, and let me know what you thought in the comments.